Hello and welcome to another episode of the Master Mind, Body, and Spirit Show. I am your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest's fascination with all things apocalyptic began over 20 years ago, whilst baiting Jehovah's Witnesses on his doorstep. He regularly gives talks on ayahuasca and Santo Daime, on revelation in the history of science and cognition, and other wonderful things. He's the author of Science Revealed and Neuro-Apocalypse. Welcome to the show, Reverend Danny Nemu. What's up, brother?
Hello, how you doing? You right?
I'm great, man. It's good to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
So, my friend, I got connected through the Psychedelic Press. I've had some of your colleagues on the show. They've been wonderful guests, really interesting and fascinating topics. Your background and your books are just as fascinating, just as interesting. So I'm very excited to dive in researching your work and what you're doing. So to get the readers a little bit caught up to speed, do you want to just give them a little bit of your background first, a little bit about the books you've written, and then we're going to dive right into some of the work because it's really fascinating stuff.
Okay. You mentioned fascination with all things apocalyptic, and that's been pretty constant thing going all the way back. I've always just been obsessed by the apocalypse, at least since my teens, and I'm 40 now, and it hasn't gone away. But my take on what the apocalypse is has changed quite a lot over time, and apa means a way, and calyptin is a veil. And the apocalypse, when I'm talking about the apocalypse, I'm talking about the unveiling. So I'm interested in that from all kinds of perspectives. So my kind of academic background was I began studying kind of biology and neuroscience and that kind of thing. So I was interested in what we see and what we miss, as in what is veiled in our perceptive sphere. And then I kind of got interested in the history of science in terms of collectively what we see and what we miss, as in what is truth, what is reality, how do scientific institutions manage what truth is, what's allowed to be true. And then I got really interested in revelation as it applies to scientists. So people who've discovered things in dreams or in visions, like Tesla discovered invented most of his things whilst he was going on kind of fantastic mental, somewhat shamanic journeys. So that kind of fascinated me. And then the Jehovah's Witnesses, they turned up at my door when I was a little bit high, and I needed to do a dissertation on something, and they just started talking, and I was just amazed by these people. And initially I was interested in their perspective on medicine, because they have some funny ideas about medicine. And obviously they're an apocalyptic group, and I got interested in comparative history of apocalyptic groups, so particularly American 17th century Protestant groups, puritanical groups, and looking at how totally new perspectives on thought influence culture, and how culture influences thought, and it's just the rabbit hole goes deeper and deeper and deeper. Then I got into scripture, and it all went completely weird. And of course, psychedelics pops in there as well, because psychedelics are another way of lifting the veil. So I'm interested in all of those things.
Amazing. Okay, so the one question that I popped up there, what is the veil to you? I've read it. I'm familiar with it. I have my own thoughts. But for you, when you're talking about the veil, what do you mean?
Well, what do we see and what do we miss, and how do we? Something's going on out there. Arguably, nothing's going on out there. Who knows? But something's going on inside my head, and it's somehow related to something phenomenological, which might or might not be going on out there. But that changes according to a whole load of different stuff. So to give you kind of one example of some research, if you get someone to point at a hill in the distance, or if you point at a hill in the distance and you say to someone, how steep is that hill? If they're young and fit, they're likely to underestimate how steep the hill is. And if they're old or unfit, they're likely to overestimate how steep the hill is. And if they're young and fit and carrying a heavy bag, they're likely to overestimate it as well, which shows us just how much the world is warped as we interpret it. So I'm kind of fascinated with the neurobiology of that. Other examples of if someone points a gun at you in the police report, people always report that the gun was bigger than it actually was. and they report that people who are nearby who could have helped were actually further away. So that kind of that's one way in which there's a veil. You kind of mentioned, did you mention, maybe that's before we went live, but we were talking about autism and some of the visual warping of the scene is pretty interesting with autism. There's a guy called what was his name now? I think it was J-Mac, who was a kid who was really fascinated by basketball in a way that autists will often get completely fascinated by something. He was into basketball, and he was the mascot of his school team. And so it was his job to kind of provide towels and water for people. And they let him play in the last, I think, 3 minutes of the last game of the season. And his first shot missed wildly, his second shot missed wildly. But then he started just like knocking in baskets from all over the court. And he scored, I can't remember the exact figures, but it was something like 15 points in a couple of minutes, and just loads of 3-pointers. And everyone was kind of blown away by the fact this autistic kid was just so fantastic at basketball. And he describes how he saw the basket as, I think his words were, a big old bucket that was huge, right? So you get it also in kind of reports of autists who can look at a tree and count every single leaf on the tree, or there's that scene in Rain Man where the guy drops some toothpicks and he counts all the toothpicks, and that stuff is partly to do with how the visual cortex works with autistic people. But also, there's people who we tend to think of as deficient in some sense, but they are in many ways not just the savants, but in many ways the autists are much better at a whole load of stuff than we are, and part of that is because they don't categorize in the same way that we do. So if I look at a tree, I just see a tree, but certain people see every leaf on the tree, so. That's kind of part of it. I mean, that's the neurobiological side of it. But also, what do we believe? What laws do we labour under? Why do we labour under those laws? And also how linguistics feeds into that. So one of the chapters in my book, Neuro-Apocalypse, grew out of the 6 years I spent in Japan. And it's a comparison of Japanese and English, those two languages, and also the psychology of perception in those two languages. So you find, for example, if you show an animation of fish moving around in a tank, you show that to an American, the American will likely say there was a big fish, and then go on to describe what the big fish was doing. And whereas a Japanese will much more likely say it looked like an aquarium, and then he'll go on to describe much more background stuff and also relational stuff between the fish, right? But what's really interesting is if you then take one of those fish out of its background and you show it to the Japanese and the American like a couple of minutes after they've looked at the animation, and you put it on a different background, that doesn't make any difference at all to an American and probably to an English person as well. But Japanese take longer to remember or to work out whether the fish was in the original animation if it's on a different background, and they also make more mistakes, right? And so they seem to code the individual and the context together, whereas that doesn't happen quite so much with Americans and with English people. And part of that is, I believe, to do with how nouns and verbs work in their language, because the nouns are not very well defined in Japanese. Often, you can say, I like the dog, I like dogs, I like your dog. If it was, it's a bit like, we might say, I like pork and I like pig, or something like that. That's not a very good example. But they don't have, generally they don't use plurals, they don't use the and a, they don't use articles, and stuff is very much more vague and very much more context based, and the whole language works very, very differently. And you see that right the way through their culture, the relationship between the individual and the context. So, for example, you see that in, famously, Japanese don't take very much time off work, and the salary man is very much tied to his workplace. So that's one thing. You also see in the stone gardens, you often see like one boulder, and it will be contextualized with all the gravel kind of raked around it, or you might see it in suibokuga, the kind of charcoal paintings will often have one lonely traveler or something with all this softly rendered scenery around it. And the important thing in Japanese art and Japanese culture in a big way is how the individual relates to the context, right? So there's no example, there's no still life in Japanese art, for example, because stuff doesn't make sense when it's divorced from its context.
Fascinating. What I'm thinking of right away is the basketball kid. I saw that video, and I've also seen. I'm not sure if he has autism, but it's this guy who has something like that, and he can remember languages really quick. So they had him do Icelandic or something. That's a super challenging language, and he's able to articulate what's happening in his brain to other people. So, is there anything that you've learned from studying the neurology of these people and beliefs and language that I can or the listener can apply to our lives to allow us more freedom through our own veil? Because when we're talking about the veil, everybody is seeing the world through their own perspective. And that's just, you can't not, right? It's your prism. So for me, when I'm learning and researching, it's so I can receive more information and more truth in the same way. So I'm just curious if they're from doing that research is something that's practical that we can apply that you've learned, maybe belief systems that you've seen or processes that you've come across.
Yeah, loads. Different meditative traditions have been studied. What's the name? Andrew Newberg. I think the guy's name is Andrew Newberg. Let me just look that up, actually. Yeah, Andrew Newberg. So he was he looked at the brain scans of Pentecostal Christians and nuns. I think it was Catholic nuns and also Buddhist monks, right? And he looked at them whilst they were doing their practices. And one of the things is going to get quite complicated, so hold tight. One of the things that happens when not when the Pentecostals are different, but when the nuns and the monks meditate, there are certain regions of the brain which are inhibited, right? They're not so active, and those regions are the parietal lobe at the back and or the kind of top here, and the temporal lobe at the side, right? The frontal lobes are not inhibited. The frontal lobes, which is kind of making connections, that's very broadly speaking, and also inhibiting behavior that the frontal lobes do. They do loads of stuff. But what is inhibited is so the parietal lobe, right? The parietal lobe is the part of your brain which puts the edge on things. So again, when I look at a tree, I see a tree because that edge. Well, my body. Well, I don't actually. I see a thing, right? A thing. Whereas an autist looking at that particular scenery might see a branch and then some leaves and then a trunk, and then it will slowly coalesce into a thing. So that process of putting edges on things, putting definitions, like defining something. Definition is well, that's what the Latin word means. It means finis, de finis. The finish is the edge or the end, right? So with the parietal lobe inhibited, the forming of edges happens slower. And then with the temporal lobes inhibited, the categorization of stuff happens slower as well, because that's the association cortex. So I might see, for example, I see a creature and my temporal lobes will go, oh, that's a dog. And it's like that other dog and that other dog. And it's like that dog that bit you as well. And then maybe that dog that you liked. So all the kind of limbic stuff, the pleasure centers, the pleasure and pain, all that kind of stuff gets put in there as well. Now with autists, it seems that their neuronal networks are more diffuse, if you like. So each neuron, kind of the end of it, has a whole load of bits coming off, and they connect to other neurons, right? And when you're a child, the small children have loads of these things going on, forming, and then you have a process of what's called synaptic pruning, which means that a lot of these get cut down, so the more long distance connections get more established. So every time we see a dog, we don't have to kind of calculate, okay, it's got 4 legs, and it's got a tail, and it's got like we know it's a dog because that pathway has been much more established by synaptic pruning. Now in autistic people, that process of synaptic pruning happens much less. So their networks retain that kind of diffuse, diffusion, if you like. So, for example, you mentioned this guy, you mentioned someone who could articulate their brain process. I think the guy who learned Icelandic, if I'm not mistaken, it was Daniel Tammet, who also, he's a synesthete. He can see, he sees numbers in terms of shapes, and he can't tell right from left as well. He's a fascinating guy. If we're talking about the same guy, he was very, he had quite severe epilepsy when he was a child, and really severe autistic. He was very, very withdrawn, and he just screamed all day, basically. And then he had a series of very severe epileptic fits, and he came out of it relatively kind of normal, but extremely high functioning, right? I haven't heard him describe his processes in particular detail, but there's a guy by the name of Kim Peek who's now passed away, and he had he was the inspiration for the guy in Rain Man. And he'd like read most of the books in the Salt Lake City Library, for example. He used to read one page with each eye and then recall the information years later. In fact, he used to love going to theatre, but he had to stop going to theatre because he used to call out when the actors made a mistake because he'd memorized the entire play. And the ideas would seep into his head. And one time he describes his process of cognition. He's played the opening bars of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which go da 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 da, right? So it's incredible how his mind works. But so he then makes the association between that and dot 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 dash, which is which da 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 being dot 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 dash, which in Morse code is the code for V. And in Roman numerals, V is 5, which is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? So you can kind of see how an incredibly diffuse network can assist can go some way to explain how the incredible memories that some autists have. And another thing which helps to explain that is in terms of this categorization. So, for example, if I was to give you a list of words, and they were words which were tastes and words that were sweet things. So if I was to say donut, bitter, cookie, sour, and a whole load of words like that, right? What your mind would probably do, and if I asked you to repeat those words back to me, what you would probably do is you would list all the tastes, and then you would list all the sweet things one after the other, right? Because we naturally categorize stuff. Autists don't do that. In fact, the whole abstract world, like what is the idea of a taste? A taste is the idea of taste is not a concrete thing. Sweet is a concrete thing, but taste is not. It's a kind of collection of all these concrete things, right? So one thing is that they will remember those words better, and you can ask a trick question. If I was to give you a long list and then to say was the word sweet on that list, right? In English, you say candy, but we say sweet is candy, right? So sweet is both a taste and it's also a sweet thing. So 99% of neurotypical people will be tricked by that question and say, yeah, it was on the list, because by rights it should be on the list because it fits into both categories. Now, an autist won't be tricked by that trick question. So that kind of recall is, we miss the detail in a way that autistic people don't. So to get back to your question, how can we assist this process, or what can we do with our own mind? Yeah, one thing is meditation. Meditation seems to, like I say, it inhibits the parietal cortex, and people describe merging with either merging with God. The nuns describe merging with God. The Buddhist monks will describe merging with the process of meditation itself, or people will describe merging into some kind of higher power. And this doesn't, sometimes this happens spontaneously, or sometimes it happens when you take big doses of magic mushrooms or acid or one of those other things, which also helps to. It doesn't quite inhibit the lobe itself or the cortex itself, but the part of the brain, the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is one of the connector hubs, which kind of passes information around the brain, is inhibited by psilocybin, for example. So I mean, I've had one experience, for example, lying under an apple tree on mushrooms in Wales one time, and just I could kind of see and feel how the edge of the tree was porous with the sky, and so you kind of feel the transpiration, the air going in and the nutrients going in, the light coming in, and how the roots were kind of pressing down into the earth, but there was no real definition between or barrier between the tree and the rest of the world, and also myself sinking into the ground and sinking into this process, and all three of us, the world and the tree and me, all kind of melting together. So that's you can lose the edges on that one as well. And there's actually something else I want to say on this while we're on the subject, is that the word in Hebrew is dabar, right, or davar, depending on how you pronounce it, word. And it comes from the Hebrew root, which means to arrange things in order, arrange things in a row, right? And this idea of arranging things in a row, let's give you an example of it. Imagine you're on the beach, right? And there's a whole lot of shells scattered about the beach, and you start to arrange them into a row, right? What have you got? Now you've got something. You've got a thing. Oh, by the way, word also means thing. That's a fascinating thing about that word davar or dabar in Hebrew. It means both word, as in defined thing, and thing, right? So what have you got when you arrange shells on the beach? Well, you've got a line now. You didn't have a line before. You had chaos, but now you've got order, right? Because something has been ordered. And you've also got this side of the line, and you've got that side of the line, right? So they've actually got one thing, but you've got three things, which is kind of fascinating. And the logos, I mean, logos, which also means word. When like Philo talks about the logos, he's a Jewish philosopher around the time of Christ, and he talks about the logos, that which the glue which joins everything together, and also the great divider which pushes things apart. So it's kind of a paradox, but that's what the word does. It kind of, like a category. Well, that's actually a name, which is another thing. But a word brings a tree together into the tree form, or that form, and it also separates it off from everything else. So yeah, meditation, certain meditations, doses of psychedelics, but also love, merging with the other, whether that is with your beloved, or whether that's kind of when a party really gets kicking and everyone's having a lovely time, there's a certain, or you get it on the dance floor as well, like there's a certain merging which happens, and you don't necessarily need psychedelics for that, but looking out for, I think it's fundamentally an understanding of the fact that edges are very much defined in our minds, like that line on the beach. Where is it? I mean, it was just shells before, now it's a line on the beach, but is it a thing, or is it something in our mind? Is it a word?
Wonderful. Wonderful, man. I was taking notes the whole time. I think the first thing that I was going to comment on was the edges of shutting down those regions of the brain, because monks will talk about the oneness, or meditators or things like that. It becomes a direct experience through meditation, and that's how I know that I've had that feeling. And there are insights, and there are ways that the brain and my consciousness is developed through meditation. It's interesting to know the science behind what is happening, but I know distinctly the feeling of oneness and experiencing it directly. And so it's interesting to see the blurred edges, because in spirituality, everything I've read always says we're all one somewhere, whether it's Lao Tzu, you know what I mean, or whatever culture. It's like we're actually all one. And so the first separation is between self and other.
Mm-hmm.
Self and tree, self and dog, self and car. And it is separate, but it's one at the same freaking time, which is a mind blower, unless you're in the experience where the edges are distorted. So then you're actually experiencing the oneness as a separate consciousness, but the same thing. So it's a bit interesting to try to relay in words, but the experience is what really gives the knowing. So I really like how you touched on that. And I'm curious about, I want to definitely get into psychedelics and the Bible and your research there, because I think that's really fascinating and interesting. But recently I was doing some research and Drumvello Melchizedek and some of his old stuff. And one of the things he said, and I've heard this before, was that immortality to the Egyptians and to some cultures wasn't not dying in a physical body. It was the ability to take memory everywhere. So, even in your dream state, you don't lose memory of your consciousness in your past. And so if there's past lives, you have all those, and you basically take memory through death. And Dan Winter talks about that as well, is our ability to take memory through death. And that's what a lot of the ancient cultures were teaching their young. The culture was to help them understand the realms of consciousness so they could do that. So I'm curious with that thought, if you've learned or come across any of that thought, because a lot of the high level stuff that I've seen, it all about memory. It seems to all have to do with memory, taking memory and consciousness into dream, and then taking memory and consciousness, into death, which then pretty much makes you immortal. But if you keep forgetting, then you think that you die and you're toast and you're afraid of death and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it's all in the word really. Remember means to bring members of a set back together, or members that are joined back together. The Socratic and also the ancient Jewish perspective on memory and this kind of idea of immortality is, well, I'll give the ancient Jewish one. First, basically, when you're in the womb or before you're born, you are taught the entire Torah, which basically means you're taught the entire world by the angels or by a particular angel. And then when you're born, the angel touches the lip, which is why there's this gap in the lip here, and you forget everything. And then the process of discovery, as in discover, taking the cover off, is a process of remembering what you've forgotten rather than learning something new, right? So this word discover is cognate with revelation, where the velum is a veil. And we're back to the idea of the apocalypse. The apocalypse is the uncovering of something, which is the discovering or the disclosure. They're all the same word. And Socrates was down with this as well. The Socratic method is asking questions, right? So Socrates didn't teach people stuff. He said, well, what do you think about this? And how about that? And he always used questions to uncover that. I'm not fully familiar with the Egyptian take on it, but I know from the myth of Osiris, he gets dismembered, and when he's killed by Set, if I'm not mistaken, and then remembered, as in all the different parts of his body get chopped up and then they get put back together. So I think this thing about remembering, I think they were definitely onto something. And I mean, your other question is fascinating. The other point you bring up about the first division being self and other, partly because that's the first thing the parietal lobe does as well. If you have damage to the parietal lobe, the edge of yourself gets confused, so people reach for stuff but they miss it. For example, they also things like body care, like they stop. People kind of stop looking after each other. They become detached from the self. So yeah, this vehicle that we need to get ourselves through life, and actually mentioning vehicle, that same lobe is engaged when we're driving as well, when we're on a bicycle. So that edge of the self can extend to the edge of a car, and actually people can get very, very defensive over their cars. Cycling around London, I've touched someone's mirror occasionally, and I find it hilarious that someone can identify with their car. But they do, it's like you've touched their balls or something. But this idea of the you say we're both one and other, and it's touched on in the first line of John. In the beginning was the Word, right? The Word. What is a word? It's a defined thing. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? Which is kind of crazy. How can something be both God and with God? You can't be something and with something. Certainly, according to Aristotelian logic or the laws of Aristotelian thought, one of them is something is either one thing or it's another. And you've got John comes along and goes talking about the logos again, just like Heraclitus, and just like and Philo. Everyone who talked about the word intelligently, the logos, had some kind of paradox when they said something. Or so Heraclitus, for example, he talks about you don't step in the same river twice, because it's a thing, but it's a different thing every time you step in it. And the person who's stepping in it is different as well. Of course, you know, if we've got bits of our bodies falling off all the time, and there's almost nothing left of my body when I was born. You know, there's a few basal cells here and there, and maybe the odd neuron, but you know, we're kind of we are human beings, as in we are being. We are in the process of being. It's present continuous, right? Because it's continuing. That makes sense what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. Well, as you share, I think of new things to ask that I'm curious about, and I think that you'd be really great to answer them. So I keep thinking I'm going to go one way, but you know, my mind opens up to a whole new possibility to ask you questions. So where I wanted to go with that is you know, I've heard in the beginning there was the word, and then I had that referred to me as the word was sound. It's sound that created light, that created matter. So I'm curious if your research has looked at that. The second thing that I wanted to pose to you was, you've done this research on the Bible, and I actually serendipitously, if that even makes sense, wrote about this today. And I never write about God, or I never quote the Bible just because it's so touchy, but I definitely consider myself to be extremely spiritual, just not religious because of, you know, the past and all that kind of heavy stuff that goes with it. But what about the Bible? Like, what is God to you? And because when I hear people like Yogananda talk, he quotes, you know, that's Autobiography of a Yogi. He quotes the Bible, and every verse he quotes and writes about, it's just magic, and it's truth, and you can feel it, and there's so much clarity in there. So I guess I was going to pose, you know, that first question about, you know, sound, then light, then matter, your thoughts on that, and then I guess, you know, to you, what God means, or what God is.
I mean, I'm gonna answer them both at the same time. I think I really like that
Nice.
first. I like both of those questions. Right. So whenever something is created in the first book of Genesis, or the first chapter of Genesis, apart from the very first line, it always begins with "and God said." Right. So, for example, "and God said, let there be light," and there was light, and God saw the light. Right. So first there is the word, and then there's the existence of the thing, and then there's the perception of the thing, right? And then there's kind of value judgments on the thing, and he thought that it was good, and so on, and he separated. So that line, for example, let's find it. This is fantastic. I'm really into Genesis. I think it's just a beautiful book. And God said, well, I'll come back to that. Right, and God said in Hebrew, V'yomer Elohim, V'yomer Elohim, right? Elohim, what is God? There's lots of different God names in the Bible. One of them is Elohim, right? Only really is only really active in the very first chapter, or certainly the first story, which is the first creation story, which is the 6 days and all that jazz. After that, you get another guy who's called Yahweh Elohim, who's busy in the garden, and he's a whole different dude. He gets angry and he puts his foot down in the garden, and he, you know, he's a much more complex character, really. Then you've got Yahweh, and Yahweh is the god of the tribe. So back to this idea, well, how far to go with this? Yahweh Elohim, to me, is the God who makes things, right? He makes things, and he gives them to Adam to name, right? The question arises, why doesn't he name them himself? Well, because the parietal lobe is the bit which makes things, as in it puts edges on things. It makes them out of the ground, right? So you've got the background, it pulls them out of the background, and it says, here, Adam, what's this? The neologism, the process of coming up with new words, is frontal lobe stuff. So I mean, the way I would interpret that, and in fact, there's who's the guy? It's another Hindu sage. Is it Aurobindo? Who has this idea of different gods being different mental processes. I don't know much about that tradition, but I've heard there's something similar in that tradition. So to me, and then you've got Yahweh, who's the god of the tribe, which is super interesting. We'll go back to the Om thing in a minute because that's really interesting. But that's the kind of extended me, you know. And Yahweh, Yahweh appears to Moses, and it's the creation of the tribe, if you like, or certainly the liberation of the tribe from Egypt, comes with that whole story. And the idea is that you really love your tribe, and then you really hate the other tribes, right? So it's us and them. So that's the second level of division. First one being me and them, and then being us and them. And I just saw this really interesting video the other day on the role of oxytocin, what's it called? Oxytocin, sorry, the love molecule. You know, is this guy critiquing this idea that it's, you know, it's that stuff which brings you together, but it's also the stuff which promotes tribal or kind of group bonding, and also hating of the other is also involved. So I think that particular hormone is involved in the functions of Yahweh. But we're kind of going off on a mad tangent there. But Vayomer Elohim, right? Elohim says, right? The word in Hebrew for say is Om. It's two letters. It's Aleph and Mem. Om. And Aleph means A, I, E, O, U. It's all the open mouthed vowels, right? Well, all my vowels are open mouthed, but it's the vowel and the mem. Now, in the letter Aum, the word Aum, the word of creation in from the Sanskrit tradition, it starts with the open mouth ah, and it ends with the closed mouth. And you see this in Chinese temples, for example. They've got like what are they? Are they dragons? Yeah, they have a dragon, and one of them's got a closed mouth or a mouth with a ball in it, and one of them's got an open mouth. You know, so this everything I believe takes place between the ah and the right? They're the two mother letters in Hebrew, Aleph and Mem. I don't know how Kabbalistic you want to get to, but this thing Om is the word, and then God. So let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and let me find it, and there was light, and God saw the light. Elohim saw the light that it was good, and Elohim called the light day. Called the light day, right? And the word for day is yom. So you've got om, which is like starts with the aleph, ah, and then you've got the ya, right? So back to this idea of who is God or what is God. Elohim starts with this aleph sound, and is a sound, or o or u is a sound which you can extend, and it's a continual production of vibrated noise coming out of the mouth. Now, when Elohim doesn't come into the world, right? You never see Elohim causing trouble in the Bible or coming and doing stuff. When he comes into the world, it's Yahweh, or it's Yah, or it's Yahweh Yireh, or it's nearly always it begins with the letter Yah, right? Now, Yah is a semi-vowel. It's not a vowel, but it's also not. You can't extend it infinitely. A Yah, like if you think of like I don't know, light year or something. That word. You can't go light ye. It's not a year anymore. It's a different thing. You're back to a ah. So I kind of see the phonics, and I've got a whole chapter in Neuro-Apocalypse about this. The phonics of the extended expression of energy of the ah coming into creation at the point where it becomes a yeah. You see what I'm saying? Which is a little bit different to the consonants, which is like b and k and all those kind of things, and f. All of those actually stop the flow of energy, the flow of sound, and also the breath, right? So the first one in the Bible is b. The Bible begins with the word, it's called b, it's called Bible. It begins with the word bereshit, right? Bereshit, it means in the beginning, also means in the head. That's another whole other story. But Barosh means in the head. The Bible can start in the head was created the gods. But anyway, so it begins with Ber, and there's this Kabbalistic story about it. The Aleph goes up to God and says, "I'm the first of the letters. Why didn't you create the world with me?" Right? And the answer given in the Talmud is it says it would be better if he who inquires into what comes before and after, what is above and what is below, it would be better if he had not been born, right? Inquiring into infinity, right? You know, that kind of scream of absolute terror. That's why we scream. When we scream, we go When we're a little bit confused, we go or You say a lot with a but with an not a whole lot you can say except the void. You know, George Cantor, the mathematician who proposed the infinite set, checked himself straight into the mental hospital after he'd done it, and then he was in and out of mental hospitals for the rest of his life. You know, inquiring into infinity is a dangerous business. So the Bible begins with a b, and the first thing that babies say is normally and then when you put a breast in their mouth, they go and babies will say ma. for the first, kind of 4 months of their lives, basically. That's the word in Hebrew is ima, ama, mama, all connected with the word mother, right? But when a baby when it stops murmuring and starts to mumble and then babble, it's starting to chop up that flow of breath. You see what I'm saying? The is it. You have to be able to control the breath before you can actually do a and control the lips and stuff, which is different to going is kind of the first word, and very interesting because Brahma, for example, is the creator god in the Puranic tradition. The first word of the Bible is bara, beit resh aleph, which also means to create, by the way. Bara, bereshit bara Elohim is how it goes. So it's got this word create, which is bara, which is also the name of Brahmin. And it's also, we have it in the word baby, we have it in the word baba and babbling, and all kinds of words that are associated with babies have a lot to do with and particularly the other, like baba is poo in some languages. Yeah, I mean, we could go on for forever about this kind of thing.
Man, well, that was a very in-depth and fascinating answer. So it again led me to another series of questions. So I don't know if I'm clear on what that means, like what is God for you, because I wanted to kind of reiterate that question, like, because when I basically wrote about it today, I talked about one of the things that I think people miss is like God, in Egyptian culture. Again, I just got back from Egypt with Nassim Haramein and the Resonant Science Foundation. And so in the hieroglyphs, they're saying God actually equals nature, and like spirit, right? Or source. And in that case, it is in everyone. We are God, you know what I mean? I am that I am, all that kind of fun stuff. We have that source spark as so does everybody else. So kind of your perception on what God is, but also what that beautiful and very in-depth information set that you just offered there. I'm curious on, what your perception of the Bible is. Like, what is it? I've heard before that, you're going to read the Bible and you're going to get from it your perception. So if you read with it with an open and loving heart, you will see the loving, the love in the Bible. If you see it from anger and this perception, you will see anger and perception. So I kind of wrote down a few things that you could answer as you wish, but what is the Bible really? What have you learned from it? What are powerful lessons you've learned? What is it for? And how should it be read? Like, how have you interpreted it? Because with a clear mind, maybe it could be thought forms. It's actually all allegory for thought forms, or it's actually breaking through these mental perceptions, or it's a physical story and it's this guy in the sky and all that stuff. So just curious about that bit of information. And then you
so I'll answer the easy question: what is God? The answer is it would be better if he who inquires into what is before and what is after, what is above and below, it would be better if he hadn't been born, right? In one sense, Elohim I kind of see as the plug socket, what you put the plug in. And I don't want to inquire too deeply into it. I wouldn't put my tongue into it, for example. I would hurt myself. It's massive voltage. And when it comes into the world, it can come into the world as a toaster. It can come into the world as a washing machine. It can come into the world as a drill or a keyboard or whatever you plug into the wall, right? So this Elohim is one name of God, and all these ones beginning with Yah, they've all got quite different personalities. Here's one, El Shaddai, for example. There's an interesting God. He's the guy who says to Abraham, "Go and sacrifice your son." And Abraham goes, "Yeah, okay," and he goes up the mountain, and then the angel of Yahweh goes, "Don't sacrifice your son." So you have different God names arguing and presenting different information, and then the prophets are, well, they get to choose. So Abraham he chooses to follow the angel of Yahweh rather than the El Shaddai, and the prophets are also obliged to argue with God, certainly from the Jewish tradition. So Moses, for example, there's this one line. Where is it? Let me find it so I can quote it nicely for you. I have to, and I'll quote it from my memory. Um, uh, Yahweh is really, really cross with the Israelites. He's cross when they make the golden calf, right? And he decides he's going to annihilate them. And Moses says, "Don't do that, man. Remember the good old days. This be far from thee to do." And God, Yahweh, repented of the evil which he thought to do. Right, repented of the evil which he thought to do. So going back to your question, about what is the Bible. The Bible is very clear. Some of the actions of Yahweh are evil. That's the word that's used, ra'ah, or bad. At least it's bad. The tree of good and evil might be better translated as the tree of good and bad, or perhaps appropriate and rotten. But whatever it is, the God behaves in an inappropriate way, or the God names behave in an inappropriate way, and it's up to the prophets to stop them. So Abraham does it as well. El Shaddai goes, "I'm off to go and destroy Sodom," and Abraham goes, "Well, what if there were 50 good men in Sodom?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, I probably wouldn't do it then." He goes, "Well, what if there were 40?" And he goes, "Yeah, well, okay, I wouldn't do it." "What if there were 25?" "Yeah, all right." And he kind of haggles him all the way down, and eventually he spares Lot. Lot gets spared, right? So Noah doesn't argue with God, doesn't argue with that particular God name, and he's criticized in the Zohar, which is a beautiful medieval Kabbalistic book. And the rabbis say, surely they were the waters of Noah. They don't say the waters of Yahweh, they say the waters of Noah, because he didn't ask for mercy on the world, right? So he's criticized for not arguing with God, right? So to relate that to the brain, El Shaddai is all concerned with the seed and territory and expansion and survival, right? That's the promises he makes to Abraham. He says you'll be as numerous as what's the metaphor use? It's as numerous as I think it's the stars in the sky. I can't remember the exact thing, but he says you'll be very numerous and kings will come out of you and all this kind of stuff. And go and sacrifice your son. Now that's what reptiles do. Snakes eat their children if they can catch them. A lot of snakes do, and those ones that don't, I won't go down there. But basically, a whole lot of reptiles do that. When a gecko has a baby, they don't show any love to the baby. They don't even look at their babies. They just kind of pop them out and they get on with their business. They don't have familial love, right? And who's going to sacrifice their son? Abraham goes, yeah, all right, because it's only his reptilian brain that is engaged. And I think that when we talk about what is El Shaddai, we're talking about that power, and it's real power that comes up from the reptilian brain, from the R complex, which is about survival and expansion, and also flight and fight and all that kind of stuff. Abraham flees as well. He goes off and he flees from where he is. Then you get Yahweh comes along. Yahweh makes different promises. He's all about the tribe. Mentioned it before. The extended you. It's all about loving, but it's also about hating. Yahweh is a war god, and tribal gods are war gods. And he gives a whole list of tribes, and he says, "Yeah, you're the children of Israel, and you're going to wipe out this tribe and wipe out that tribe and wipe out that tribe." And then when the Israelites are going across Egypt, or rather they've escaped from Egypt, they're going across the wilderness. It's just a series of massacres and looting and pillage. Right? That was kind of good tribal behaviour for the time. But so pillage isn't bad in the Bible. Pillage is really bad when it happens to you, but it's really good when you do it to other people. So kind of what Freud might call the superego, that comes in later. In fact, it's the prophets. It's the prophets which restrain all the other forces that come through them. So if you imagine this in terms of the brain, I would say that the R complex, the reptilian brain, is El Shaddai. The limbic system which is all to do with love and yours, definition of yours and theirs. Note also that the taboo, the food taboo, which Moses is given by Yahweh, is you shouldn't boil the kid in its mother's milk. You shouldn't boil a goat in its mother's milk. And what it does is it references the love that a mother has for its young, right? The thing that you have to, the covenant between El Shaddai and Abraham is different. It's circumcision. It's all about the the member or the wand of power and procreation, right? So they're dealing in very, very different spheres, and then the prophets come along, and they do have the capacity to restrain, and that's what the frontal lobes do. The frontal lobes are inhibitory. So, for example, if you have frontal lobe damage, you might behave inappropriately, or you might kind of. My mum once saw this. She was working in hospital, and someone came in, had a car crash, and their frontal lobes had been destroyed. Basically, the blood supply had been cut off, and the guy the nurses were trying to save him, but he was grabbing at their bodies. You know, he couldn't control himself. You see this also when people get really, really drunk. Tequila, for example, will inhibit your frontal lobes, and then you'll do things which otherwise you'd probably think better of. It might be fighting, or it might be lascivious behaviour, or whatever it is, as you go kind of further back into the reptilian brain, and you're more concerned with procreation and survival and all that jazz. So your other question, what is the Bible to me? You have to kind of what I've done again in Neuro-Apocalypse, my second book, is looked at source criticism and the production of the Bible over time, and basically mainstream scholarship on the matter reveals, this is like 100 years old, this is nothing new, that there are at least four documents that go into the production of the Bible, right? One of those is called the Yahwist, and it's a cycle of stories, mythology, which emerges out of the oral tradition probably around the 10th century BC. And for me, that is a supreme, the poetry is spectacular. I think, when they talk about is it written by divine hand? I think the divine hand moves in our bodies. I think that we do attain states of inspiration when we write, or something writes through us. And, if you look at like Blake, for example, William Blake describes writing against his own will, his hand moving and him trying to stop it. When artists are on tip-top flow state, which again you can relate to the energy coming out a little bit like when the vowel is coming out without anything stopping it. But that's another way. Oh, don't want to go down that tangent. But art can reach a kind of divine level of brilliance, and I think that's what you've got with the oral tradition that got condensed into the Yahwist. That's the first level, right? Now, that was written basically at the beginning of the monarchy, but it keeps the traditions of the Commonwealth, right? So then you get a monarchy, so you get Saul and you get David and you get Solomon, and by the time you get to Solomon, you've got a corrupt monarchy. You've got Solomon who's extracting massive amounts of gold from his various territories, and he's got, I think it's 300 concubines or wives, and he rests his feet on a golden footstool, and all his cutlery is made out of gold. And so when he dies, his son is approached by the northern tribes, and they say, "Please lower our tax burden." And he says, "My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Where he chastises you with whips, I will chastise you with scorpions." And he raises their tax burden. So then the two kingdoms, they become kingdoms at that point. The kingdom splits into two kingdoms. You've got the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and you've got the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. And then they go to war. And then what happens is you get this other text which arises out of the northern kingdoms, because they kind of retell the stories, but they put their own slant on it. So you get them talking about houses rather than tents, for example, and you get them talking about strangers and a whole bunch of different vocabulary, because it's 200 years later, and it's from a different region. So then, for whatever reason, actually in 722 or thereabouts, the Assyrians overrun the northern kingdom, destroy it completely, and a bunch of refugees arrive in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom, and they bring their Elohist text, and somehow that kind of gets fused with the Yahwist text, and it becomes one text, which is why you have stories which change halfway through, like so Moses' flood lasts for 40 days, or actually it lasts for 150 days, and because you've got different traditions come together with their two stories, or the guys who steal Joseph. Is it the Ishmaelites, or is it the what's the name of the other tribe? I forget the name of the other tribe. But it changes halfway through the story because they're from different oral traditions or different written down oral traditions. But one of the things about the Elohist is that it disses the priests in a big way. It's really rude about Aaron because they have a different priestly line. So Aaron is the guy who makes the golden calf and causes a whole load of trouble, right? So by this time, Jerusalem has centralized in a big way, and the priests have become very powerful. They don't like this diss upon their line because they're the guys in charge. Everyone gives them their tithes and so on and so forth. So then they produce another text, probably somewhere between the 8th and 6th century BC, or kind of compiled in that time. That's called the priestly document, and that's where you get a whole load of law coming in, right? So what do you do with a leper? What do you do with someone who's accused of adultery? And also all these genealogies of this one begat that one and that one and this one, because the priestly line is establishing its right to talk about or their kind of blood right or their birthright to be the priests. So that's the third document, the priestly document, and all of these books get combined at different points in history, and then you get another one. So then you get another couple of kings. Hezekiah is one of them, who decide they're going to smash all the shrines in the countryside, and you're only allowed to sacrifice your basically you're only allowed to eat your own food if you've taken it up to Jerusalem to be tithes first. So they centralize the cult, but they also centralize, more importantly, the economy at Jerusalem. Because before then, you could go to your local shrine and you could have your tithe taken, make your sacrifice, then you could eat your food. But they did this kind of massive effort in centralization, and then along with that, I mean, there were two attempts to do it, but the second time they also had this book called Deuteronomy, right, or basically Deuteronomy, what became Deuteronomy, and that's all the property laws, and that gets really, really, I mean, it's just capitalism basically, and it always protects the property owner. So if you look quite deeply into, and that's quite influenced by the Hammurabi Code and also other law codes around there. But in the first one, the Yahwist, there's no laws at all. There's one, and it's don't eat blood, right? And in the second one, they've got what's called the 10 Commandments. It's not actually 10, and they're not. Well, it gets really confusing. But anyway, that seems to be imported by the Assyrians, because the Assyrians and the Northern Kingdom made an alliance, and they started kind of importing law codes from there. So what's the Bible? The first couple of layers of it are, for me, revelation, spectacular poetry, which describes, among other things, how our own brains work. And then afterwards, you've got a kind of layer of priestcraft, which controls how people. These are the guys who mediate between God and man, if you like. So rather than doing it, they take up that intermediate position and all their laws. And then you've got another layer of a kind of basically proprietarian mores and taboos. The reason why, I know I'm talking a lot, excuse me, but the reason why this is so fascinating is you see a similar progression in science, because often scientists will they will discover things through revelation, right? Like I mentioned before, whether it's Tesla or whether it's Calvin who's sitting in his car and he suddenly gets the Calvin cycle, all the substrates which describe how sunlight is absorbed into chlorophyll. Or there's loads of examples. Kekule, for example, who discovered the benzene ring when he was half asleep, and he kind of saw the snake grabbing its tail. There's lots of, basically, most interesting stuff in science comes through revelation. And then it gets submitted to the journals, and the journals, the people who run the journals seem to me like the kind of layer of priestcraft, who decide what gets published, what kind of things are taboo knowledge, also deal with authority. And then you get like the companies which sell the products of science, your pharmaceutical companies and stuff. So it seems to be a natural progression in humanity, is from revelation to priestcraft to capital, as it kind of descends through the layers and things get more and more fixed and more and more far from the source, if you like.
Extraordinary. Holy smokes. Wow, brother. Okay, holy crap. That was super epic, man. There's a few different ways that I'm thinking about going here, and we'll leave it up to you because there's a lot more that I want to talk about. You're obviously very adept at this subject, and there's a lot that I want to uncover. So I think that I'm going to have you back again, but I'm going to open up one can of worms I haven't even been able to get to. because there's been so much incredible stuff. But a lot of your work talks about psychedelic use in the Bible. This is not my first time hearing this. It seems to be quite obvious from my opinion, because you can look at the art. There's a lot of case for it. So do you want to speak a little bit on what you found about psychedelic use? Because I find it very fascinating that, how much it's been demonized. Things like mushrooms, or, it comes from the ground. Why would God put it there? You're not changing in it anyway, right? You're not going through a process. And also what happens, what's the result of what happens when you experience these states? For me, they're generally useful if done in a respectful way. So I'm just curious if you wanted to share a little bit about your research on what you found as far as psychedelic use goes in the Bible, and anything pertinent to that area.
Well, God has no problem with plants. There's a whole lot of unkosher animals, for example, and there's textiles that you can't weave together, and there's a whole lot of stuff which is not kosher. But all the plants are good. Like, plants are all right. So what have we got in the Bible? Well, I got some for you here. Frankincense. That's frankincense, right? Frankincense works on the GABA receptor system. It works on GABA receptors, basically. It works on the same system as Valium. The good dose of, you can just eat this stuff. It's lovely. You don't have more than about the size of a couple of peas, basically, is probably a good dose. So I'll demonstrate what's a good dose. If you have much more than this, you're going to start to offend the. You see how much I got there? Like about yay much. So a couple of chunks about that size. That if you eat much more than that, you're going to start to offend the intestinal flora in your gut. But frankincense is lovely. Eat some, see what happens. It works. It's called a tranquilizer. It works on the GABA system. GABA receptors are the most common receptor in the brain. So it's kind of inhibitory. It slows you down. But when we slow down, we notice stuff that we don't notice when we're going fast. So just because something's inhibitory doesn't mean to say that the revelations seem to come when stuff gets inhibited. So that's frankincense. Myrrh works on the opioid system. It works on mu and delta receptors. And then what else have you got? You've got saffron that works on the GABA system. You've got cinnamon. I guess maybe it's more interesting if I talk. There's loads of drugs in the Bible, basically. There's a stack of drugs in the Bible. It's just psychopharmacology. I've given a talk about this at Breaking Convention, so you can look that one up online. But I guess what's interesting is how they're combined and how they're used. And there's a bunch of technologies, but two of them I'll talk about. One of them is what's called the Shemen HaMishcha, which is the massage oil. Mishcha comes from the word mashah, and that means to paint or to wipe. It's where we get the word massage from. So the idea that the anointing oil was poured on your head, like it is in the Eastern churches, seems to be a bit deluded. It was a massage oil, and back in Egypt, going back to Egypt, they had a very similar one using the same ingredients except taking away one. And that was definitely a massage oil, and it was reserved only for the pharaohs. So the Shemen HaMishcha, the anointing oil, it's where we get the word Messiah from, actually. Mashiach is the anointed one. That's where we get the Messiah from. And Christos as well. Christos means the one who's had the chrism, which is, again, anointing. It's all to do with anointing. So the anointing oil, what is it? It's a mixture of cinnamon, cassia, and myrrh, and then this stuff called cane bossum. And so cinnamon, cassia. Cinnamon contains, let me get this right, eugenol, and eugenol is what you can make MDMA out of. Cassia contains estradiol, which it's described, if you take it, if you inject it, it has an electric LSD-like effect, right? The reason these things, if you just eat a load of cinnamon, it won't do you any good, is because you have the cytochrome system. You have a bunch of enzymes which break it down. Nutmeg is different. If you eat nutmeg contains both psychoactive agents, but also enzyme inhibitors. A little bit like ayahuasca. You can eat as much DMT as you like, and it probably won't do much for you. You have to inhibit your monoamine oxidase enzymes first. So the P450 enzymes that need to be inhibited, there's quite a wide spectrum of them, and to hit all of them, you need a kind of combination of a different bunch of things. So cassia inhibits some of them, cinnamon inhibits other ones, myrrh inhibits other ones, right? So you've got all of these three which go in, and then you've got Cannabidium, right? No, it's called Cannabis in the singular. It seems to be very likely that it is cannabis, right? Chris Bennett has done a bunch of research on this. So has Sula Bennett. Sula Bennett originally was a linguist who was looking into folk uses of hemp. Cannabis was used in every single culture around Palestine. Herodotus visits the Scythians in 500 BC, describes how they take cannabis, what they call cannabis, and they fold down the flaps of their tents and they throw it on the fire, and then they jump up and down and they sing, and he says it's better than any Grecian vapor bath, right? But cannabis was everywhere. It's on in Egypt. It's on the mummy of Ramesses II, the pollen, and it didn't grow in Egypt. It had to be imported, and it was imported through Palestine because that was the trade route. So absolutely certainly cannabis was going through. And this stuff, Cannabosum, which is, like I say, it means fragrant cane, right? Canna is cane. I like getting fragrantly cane sometimes. So that's one of the mixes, right? And it's made into an anointing oil, and away you go. But only the priests were allowed to put it on, and there's taboos around it. You're not to get drunk or really drunk beforehand, and once you've got it on you, you're not allowed to stumble out and through the streets, which is good advice for anyone who's going to be doing a psychedelic session. There's a really interesting tantric book. It's called the Kalachakra Tantra, which describes the mix of nutmeg and myrrh, right? The Israelites didn't have access to nutmeg because it grew in the middle of nowhere in like the Banda Islands, but the Indians did. So the mixture of nutmeg and myrrh has a very similar chemical profile to what was in the anointing oil. And there's a really interesting, I'm going to read it actually, it's an Erowid report from a guy who made the mixture of nutmeg and myrrh. And then he went to sleep, and then he woke up. And this is what he said when he wakes up. He says, awakening as if possessed by a fierce and aggressive deity, deep, monstrous voice boiling out of me, unbidden. Open-eyed visions and closed-eyed visions of a bulging-eyed, white-skinned man in ceremonial armor. The real world perceived as a faraway and distorted window. The window also emanated and originated a mental fireball or supernova. This fireball had as its identity the fierce deity above. My voice seemed to penetrate the walls and echo off the sky. New doors, avenues opened up inside familiar mantra, new knowledge disclosed, new perspectives on hidden meaning. So we've got the disclosure of new knowledge we talked about before, the apocalyptic side, but also the fact this guy's a war god, right? It's a ceremonial armor, it's fierce, it just sounds very, very much like Yahweh. And what was this stuff used for? It was used very specifically, it was put on kings when they were going to be kings, so they could know Yahweh, and it was put on priests so they could minister unto Yahweh. So it gives you a direct experience of Yahweh. The proviso there, why I don't want people to think, I don't think that Yahweh is a result of alobenzene chemistry. I think that the same way my glasses, if I put my glasses on, stuff like people's faces come into focus. That doesn't mean to say people's faces are a product of my glasses. It means that my glasses make those things much more easy to see. So this is one way of getting in tune with those powers of Yahweh. So you've got the tabernacle, right? The tabernacle is described, I think it gets 5 chapters in the Bible, described in immaculate detail, everything from the size of how far apart the rings are, and how many bits of acacia you make the frame out of, and how many skins, and nothing in the Bible is described in anything like that much detail. In fact, the Bible doesn't really dwell on stuff very much. It moves pretty quickly. So the Tower of Babel is over in half a chapter, right? The flood doesn't take very long. This gets 5 chapters on how to make a tent. And what do you get at the end of it? You got the main part of it, which is full of all kinds of other psychoactives. I don't know if we can go into that. But at the back of it, you've got a chamber, and it's 4.5 meter cubed chamber, and it's got 4 skins. So it's got two bits of material pulled tight around an acacia frame, and then it's got 2 other bits of material which are kind of pulled tight but separated off as a kind of windbreak, right? And then you've got a veil. You've got a veil right at the front of the tabernacle, and you've got a veil at the back of at the front of this. It's called the Holy of Holies, but it's basically this. It's a hot box basically at the back of the tabernacle, and at least in the time of the temple, the veil is described as the thickness of a man's hand. So that's a massive veil. So the question arises: why does it have to be so thick? right? If it was to keep Yahweh inside, well, he's not going to be contained by a veil. But if it was designed to keep people's prying eyes out, well, it doesn't matter how thick it is, but it's a thick veil and it would make an airtight box. So what do you do inside this thing? Well, you take handfuls of finely ground incense and you stick it on a sensor, and then you sit and you look at the magic box, which is made out of acacia, which is, by the way, the highest concentration of DMT in the region, and you communicate with angels. And it's very clear in the Bible that the angels appear through the agency of the cloud. It's the cloud of incense itself which transmits either the voices or the visions. Now, what's in that incense? In the Talmud, it's described. I think it's got 16 ingredients in the Bible. I'll list them here. Stacta, which is myrrh, which is opioid, works in the opioid system. Onycha, I'm not sure what that is. Galbanum, which is a GABA agonist. Frankincense, which is a GABA agonist. Another myrrh. Cassia, which contains eugenol, which you make MDMA out of. Spikenard, that's an interesting one. That's also the stuff that Jesus' feet are washed in. Spikenard boosts serotonin, boosts dopamine, and boosts GABA in the brain. It's described as nootropic, which means it assists in the formation of memories. So people are going in there, they're getting anointed with quite serious mix, and then they're going, or then just one guy, actually, the high priest is going and then getting a smoke bath in a whole bunch of tranquilizers. So it'd be quite good. The idea is that he gets information and then he brings it back to the tribe. So it might often war divination, what time do we move, what time do we run, but it can also be for the health of the tribe. Does everything that a traditional shaman would do in their tribe to look after their tribe, going off on his own and spending time with his magical objects or her magical objects. In fact, we'll talk about the shamans, not in the Bible, and then coming back with information for the tribe. So what else have you got? The saffron. Saffron's another GABA agonist. Also allowed in the Islamic tradition, funnily enough. Costus, and you've got cinnamon, and like something like I think about 12 or so of these ingredients are psychoactive, in this smoke. And then you've got the showbread as well. I mean, I could go on and on. There's just loads and loads of drugs in the Bible. But what's really interesting is that there's very kind of advanced technologies of combination of them as well. Enzyme inhibition. We didn't manage to get monoamine oxidase inhibition until I think it was like the mid 20th century that we managed to do it. So in the jungle, the indigenous traditions had monoamine oxidase inhibition. They're making ayahuasca at least several hundred years ago. They got it before us. And it looks like that the Israelites, and before them the Egyptians, because the Egyptians used combinations of these herbs as well, and they made the pyramids, man, and they did brain surgery. These guys knew their stuff. They were masters of the sciences and the apothecaries.
Man, every time I pose a question, I come back with just a world of fantastic, deep information. It's been a privilege to be on the other side. And every time you speak, I am opened up to new questions and possibilities to dive deeper into your mind, brother. This has been really fascinating. What I want to ask from this is, we've been going for a bit. I want to invite you back on the podcast again, because I know the 3 questions or 4 questions that I have lined up are all going to be, 15 to 20 minute answers that we can then dive deeper on.
Okay.
So from here, what I'd like to do is just maybe end on or open up the conversation of what's your view on the apocalypse? I've heard a lot on the veil, or the harvest. The Bible talks about the harvest. We're also talking about the ascension. You're talking about the apocalypse, the end of times. My personal perception of what I've seen looking into this kind of stuff is an evolution of consciousness, maybe similar to the way that you're phrasing it, and more awareness, more light, breaking through this veil of having this understanding, which you and I have both experienced, this heightened state through mushrooms or sometimes meditation. Whatever you get it, there is more to consciousness that you know when you're speaking to somebody who has had that experience and who has not. And it's usually the people who have not had the experience who want to tell you what reality is and what's possible, and and what you should and shouldn't do. And then on the other side, when you've had this mind expanding experience, this oneness, or however you get, normally you're more open to new ideas and new thoughts and new experiences. So I guess the last question I'll ask, and love to have you back on, but want to be respectful of your time and what you got to do today. For you, when you're talking about the apocalypse, what are you talking about? And do your thoughts reflect mine in the veil and the harvest and what that is? And my thought right now is it's something along the lines of a conscious evolution that we can choose to expand and experience a higher state, or choose the opposite, choose something else.
Yeah, choose life. So yeah, the end of time. Let's go with that one. If you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, there's no mention of the end of time, the end of days. All of that kind of stuff comes much later. It comes with the book of Daniel, for example, which was written, I think, about the 2nd century BC, and it's the Israelites didn't have a concept of anything beyond the land of Israel, right? That was as much as it was. So when you read about the Noah's flood, it doesn't say Noah's flood flooded the world. It says Noah's flood flooded the land, or Eretz. There isn't a word for world, basically. There's a word for revealed, which is olam, sometimes translated as world. But basically it means it flooded the land, it seems. So they didn't have a global conception. They didn't have a concept of the end of time. That all comes later, and I'm pretty sure about this. It comes from the influence of Zoroastrianism on Israelite religion. So Israelite religion changes, or the cult changes in a massive way, because they get extracted from their land. They get exiled in Babylon. They become slaves, basically. And then along comes Cyrus, who liberates them. And Cyrus is on a mission, right? Cyrus wants to. He creates the biggest empire that's ever existed up to that point, and the Persian Empire becomes. And he kind of puts a law code which goes extends across, and the Israelite laws are imposed back on. Kind of gets really complex. But one of the things that happens there, and it's not immediately after Cyrus, but over the following centuries, Zoroastrian cosmology, if you like, starts to influence the books of the Bible. So this idea of the end of time comes from a different cosmology. And in Zoroastrianism, you've got basically 2 gods, 2 main gods. You've got a whole bunch of angels and demons and that kind of stuff. That also seems to get imported, because there's not a whole load of angels in the Old Testament as well. But you've got 2 gods. You've got a really good God who's fantastic, and then you've got a really bad God who is all absolutely awful, right? Now, like I say, the Hebrew gods, god names, are somewhat ambivalent. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Sometimes they want to destroy the tribe. They behave like us, basically. When we're angry and want to kill everybody. I get out of the wrong side of bed, and I feel like that sometimes. But they have this completely different conception of the very good and the very bad, and that necessitates an end of time. There's a kind of constant battle going on between the good guy and the bad guy, and also the phalanges of the good guy and the phalanges of the bad guy, and that necessitates a final showdown where one of them wins and everything gets destroyed, and then there's a kind of all the stuff about the resurrection, for example, all the people coming back to life, all that kind of none of that is in the old books of the Bible. It all comes in after the Babylonian exile, the book of Daniel, and kind of other books around there, the later prophets. And this idea of absolute good and absolute bad is, I think, an absolute curse on our culture, and that is what got injected into the Christian tradition. You see it in Revelations, for example. There's a description. It talks about the serpent, that old dragon, who is Satan and who is the great deceiver, right? And it kind of mixes up all of these different characters, right? Satan, who means the enemy, right? Even in Job, which is also written in Babylon, but it's written a few centuries earlier. That character is given license by Yahweh in order to go and torment Job. So he's called the enemy, but he's not the enemy of Yahweh. He's the enemy of Job, the tormentor, and he torments him, and Job has to kind of undergoes all the torment, and he comes out of it the other side, and he gets rewarded with twice as much stuff, basically. All his children who had died he gets more, and he gets more, cows and stuff. Everything's cool for Job, but this idea of the very good and the very bad, which is the basis of law codes, basically, and absolute action. Is killing someone bad? Well, kind of, yeah, but it depends who, really. Is stealing something bad? Well, yeah, kind of, but it kind of also depends how hungry you are. Why are you so hungry? If all the money and all the resources are being denied you, is stealing something so bad? Well, it's bad for the property owning class, right? And that's what the Persian Empire, and also the Babylonian Empire. They were slave drivers, they were slave keepers, and it was a massive empire. So property is very, very important. This so where am I kind of going with this? This idea of monotheism, one God who's very, very good, who's omnipotent and omniscient. God isn't, Yahweh Elohim isn't omniscient. He asks Adam, he says, "Why did you eat the apple?" You're like, man, if you're omniscient, why don't you know? Uh, why did you put clothes on? Well, duh. But anyway, so all this kind of the really good guy who knows everything and is really fab, and it comes over into science. This idea that there is one true truth. It's completely alien to the to biblical, or certainly old school biblical philosophy. Back in the day, there were said to be 70 different faces of the Bible, because every verse can be interpreted 70 different ways, and it can mean radically different stuff. I'll give you one example of this. Right, there's this word arum and arome, right, and it's spelt the same way. And for reasons I don't really have time to go into, the vowel points, there aren't vowels in Hebrew, and you can pronounce things in different ways, and the ways that you pronounce a particular word, depending on how you pronounce it, it means something completely different. So you got this line, and they were both naked, the man and the woman, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. And that word naked is arome, right? And then the very next line, you've got, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which Yahweh Elohim had made. The word subtle is arum, and it's the same word. It's written in exactly the same way in Hebrew. The word for naked, like the innocence of Adam and Eve, and the subtlety, the slyness of the snake, is exactly the same word. And then when Yahweh Elohim says to Adam, why did you hide? He said, because I was arum, because I was prudent, because it also means prudent. So what I'm basically saying is this idea of something being absolutely good and something being absolutely bad is not there in the text right at the beginning, right? It gets imposed by Zoroaster. And I think, actually, the idea that something can be absolutely bad, like, I don't know, what is it at the moment? North Korea is just absolutely awful. Or what was it before? The axis of evil, Iraq, that whole catastrophe which cost 1 million lives, or maybe even more. You can't bomb a country with such kind of terrible violence without already establishing the fact that these people are in some way other, in some way subhuman, in some way, or they've got to be evil. And evil is you get it every time when there's someone who goes crazy with a gun. They say, "Oh, this is pure evil." I mean, what is pure evil? So I think we can actually, sadly, bring. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe in absolute good and absolute evil, and generally, we're the absolute good guys and they're the absolute evil guys, then yeah, we can bring about literally the end of days. We could do some horrific things. I like to think that as we break down the boundaries, and I think psychedelics has something to do with that, then the boundary between good and evil becomes a whole lot more porous, and we start to notice what is good about us, what's also twisted and horrible about us. And I guess you brought something up, which I just want to just disagree with a little bit, actually. This idea that mind expanding things always make us, well, it's generally people who haven't had those experiences. Ken Wilber talks about this. He talks about various kind of levels of experience. If you have a certain opening, a certain experience, it can also make you. It happens a lot with acid. It happens a lot with people who've done a little bit of ayahuasca and they come back and they say, "I'm the shaman now," and then they disappear up their asses and become like massive, horrific egos, and it's like, "Oh, I'm more enlightened than you." So I just kind of caution a little bit there, and I'm as guilty as anyone else of this, but being very, very careful about how we define who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. Certainly, I'm a daimista. My spiritual lineage is Santa Daime. We make very little of the fact that that involves drinking ayahuasca. We're pretty much forbidden from talking about it. Certainly about how good it is. It's one of the few things that's forbidden in our lineage is going out and saying, "Wow, this is amazing! You've got to try it. It's brilliant. It'll make you much better." You're not allowed to do that, right? The way to be a missionary, if you like, for whether it's Santodaime, but also just for kind of psychedelic consciousness, is by being as immaculate, as moral, and as sound as you can, and just being very, 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 very careful that you don't disappear up your own arse. You know what I mean?
I love that, man. Yeah, absolutely. Being in the space for a while, I've seen both ends of the spectrum, and certainly want to be careful in my own words of better or worse, more enlightened, less enlightened, just experiential and coming from your own truth, your own experience. And I think that the last thing that you said was the most value of being the best you can be, to be that immaculate human being to the best of your ability, and allow others to, do their best, And so if you're at your best, you probably have compassion for their best and when they're not at their best. So really valuable stuff. Go ahead.
And I mean, Christ talks about that. He talks about the greatest virtue being charity, and charity is caritas, and it doesn't mean giving stuff to poor people. That's cool too. But charity is tolerance in judging other people's opinions. That's what the original meaning of it is. And he's in some ways is the prophet who we were talking before about how the prophets can inhibit the actions of the more angry gods. He's the guy who talks about God the Father. In the Old Testament, there's no God the Father. There's the God of the tribe. There's the God of hosts and all that jazz. It looks like quite a lot of what they call the Wondervolken. I think they're called the Wondervolk. But Alan Piper's done a whole lot of research into the history of psychedelics and history and the fascism, basically. And kind of ego expansion when it's not contained in some kind of vessel or put towards some good works. That can be problematic. The Mashiach, the anointed one, was meant to be an anointed king. That was the idea. You get introduced to Yahweh, then you get all full of the power of Yahweh. Then what can you do? You can go and wipe out other tribes, and Yahweh gets cross when they don't kill all. He said, "Why have you left all the little children alive? Kill all the little children as well, and just keep the virgins for yourself." So kind of just exposure to the gods without some kind of inhibitory function as well is dangerous. There's a whole. This is kind of built into the text in the story of Jacob as well. But I guess next time we'll maybe talk about that. And also, you can read all about that in my book. Can I show you my book?
Yeah, of course, brother. That's a nice segue. Well, I wanted to ask one question that I saw a comment on Facebook. When you were talking about meditations before, you said specific meditations. Can you quickly enlighten us on what specific meditations one can use to, I don't know, your recommended meditations you find useful?
Right. Okay. Because the Pentecostalists, they, funnily enough, their meditations when they're talking tongues, right? What gets inhibited there is the frontal lobes, and you see actually when they place their hands on it, it's on the frontal lobe. That's how the gift of tongues is passed on, often with a kind of slap on the forehead from the evangelical dude, right? So what happens with them? The parietal lobe does not get inhibited, and the temporal lobe does not get inhibited, but the frontal lobe does get inhibited, which is kind of the wrong way round of doing it, really. It means that you're thinking not logical, but the bit of you which it's called divergent intelligence, but the bit of you which comes up with new ways of seeing things, new ways of doing things, is inhibited, and the bit of you which defines your edge is working just as normally. So when Pentecostalists talk in tongues, they don't talk about losing the edge of their body. They talk about their body being overcome with the Holy Spirit, but it's still very much them that is overcome with the Holy Spirit. So what would I recommend? I think I find meditation there's a couple of different ways to do it, but I kind of see it as a little bit like brushing your teeth, like not brushing your teeth all week and then furiously scrubbing on Saturdays is not really the way you want to do it. So I would kind of recommend first thing in the morning, sending roots out through the feet, That's what I like to do. Put my feet on the ground, or even when I'm still in bed, put my knees, bend my knees so my feet are on my bed. And then my first few breaths in the morning are breaking that boundary between me and the earth. So putting roots down into the ground, and then drawing up nutrients. And it might be 4 or 5 breaths, and then the worst thing you can do in the morning is grab your iPhone and immediately start getting into a mental or a text and blah, 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 before you've even made that connection. I guess another one. Again, Vipassana retreats. That's fantastic. But people who are into cannabis, and that plus silence. I guess that's what we really often people will miss is they'll smoke and then they'll chat. And I'm not saying that's wrong, or they watch telly or whatever it is, but that plus complete silence is a really, really good one. If you do that one right, you do it with your friends, you get together with a very specific intention of just being very, very quiet. Breath meditations, all that kind of thing. But I'm kind of into the old school stuff. So I would say join a Buddhist group, or one of the kind of slower yogas. I mean, Ashtanga is great if you want to get nice abs and stuff, jumping this way and that. But kind of slowness. My own lineage, like I say, is Santa Daime, and we do a whole lot of singing. Chorus singing is a good one as well. What kind of meditation do you like to practice?
Awesome. For me, originally it was just the good old sit down, sit down, and just that's the one I recommend. Sit down and just be with your thoughts and observe them, and then let them go. And then over time, you'll get bigger gaps of awareness. And that was the one that I did. It's probably one of the more challenging ones to do. I just recommend doing something. My personal, you can get singing sound bowls, there's sound healing, right? Just put on like a relaxing track. You could even call it earthing now, where you sit outside on the grass. It's so ridiculous. Sit outside, get some of those good old earth vibes, because our daily life doesn't allow us enough nature time. So that's my recommendation. Just give yourself some beautiful singing sound bowls, Tibetan bowls, music, sit down and just observe your thoughts, learn to clear your mind. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, Buddha gives the advice of training the mind is like training an elephant. And what you do is you, when the elephant's young, you put a rope around its neck, and then you put the other end of the rope on a stake, and you hammer the stake into the ground, right? And the elephant learns that it can only go as far as the edge of the circumference of that the rope will let him. You don't need to go and slap the elephant. You don't need to go and chide the elephant. You just need to wait for him to run out of steam, really, and learn that he's much more comfortable when he goes back to the center. And then when the elephant gets older and bigger, which basically translates as when your emotions are bigger and more powerful, then it's already learnt. Your mind has already learnt to return to the center, which is why you see in Thailand you see a dude on top of an elephant with a tiny little dude controlling at the rope, and that the elephant could throw him to the ground and trample him to death at any moment. But yeah, I reckon that's good. It's always good, just be easy on ourselves. But also, there's something to be said for, ordeals, climbing mountains, 10-day silent retreats, and other ordeals that you might think of.
Leave it to that. Yeah, leave it to our own devices. Okay, brother. Well, to close up, your closing thoughts, anything you want to leave the listeners with. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work. Excited to check out your work more deeply. Have you back on the podcast, because there's a few wormholes I didn't touch, but I'm sure you're going to have interesting answers for. And plug all your good stuff so we can find you. And I'm curious, does your book share about how to make any of this stuff in there? Because when I go to LA and I'm in with my, go ahead.
Well, so here's my most recent book. It's called Neuro-Apocalypse, and it is out on Psychedelic Press. If you want to get it, if people want to get it, I would recommend try not to. Get it. It's all right if you get it off Amazon, but if you get it direct from the publisher, then we actually get some money. Amazon are the rapists of the book distribution world. That's my first book. It's called Science Revealed. That's about the history of science and revelation in science. Final thought. I don't know if I'm that kind of reverend, really. But I don't know.
What website too, brother?
Oh, website, yeah. So Nemu, www.nemusend, So that's nemusend.co.uk. And then, I mean, there's a bunch of talks. There's some, if you look up Reverend Nemu or Danny Nemu and Breaking Convention, there's some talks there. There's stuff at, there's one called Taboo. What's it called? Taboo from the Jungle to the Lab, I think. That's quite an interesting one. It's about the anthropological study of ayahuasca and what we miss, what the academy misses, looking at kind of racism in the academy. And again, it's another veil, but what do we miss? What do we catch when we look at things through a certain lens? All the psychedelic press stuff. I know you've had Julian on. You've had some of our people on. So check out Psychedelic Press anyway. There's some other interesting titles on there. And a final thought. I mean, for him who inquires into that which is before and that which is after, that which is above and that which is below, it would be better if he had not been born. So I'd say keep your eyes on what's going on here. It's lovely that we have access to ayahuasca pouring out of the jungle, and we can see some extraordinary things, but we want to kind of bring that back to what's going on here. What does the ground feel like beneath your feet, and what can you do to make things better nearby? Fascination with the affairs of indigenous people is a wonderful thing, but look at what's going on in our cities, look at what's going on at the end of our street.
Wonderful. Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your work and your big brain sharing all that information. Those were super in-depth answers. I loved it, man. I learned a ton, and I know we're going to be able to do another big podcast too. So I'm super excited to have you back. But just thanks for your time, man. Thanks for your work, and thanks for coming on.
All right, thanks a lot, Matt. It's been a real pleasure to talk. I look forward to doing it again.
Amazing. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.